Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast, How Design Can Tell Your Unique Story, sponsored by Agati Furniture, richärd+bauer, and Library Journal. My name is Rebecca Joswick, and I'll be your moderator, but before we go further, I have a few housekeeping items to run through with you. If you're experiencing technical problems, please use the Q&A window on the audience console, and the webcast tech team will get to you as soon as possible. If you have questions or comments for the presenters, and I hope you do, you can also send those in at any time via the Q&A window. We'll try to save some time at the end to address your questions, and if we don't get to yours, you can expect a follow-up via email. If your screen becomes locked due to local network congestion or bandwidth issues, try using F5 to refresh your webcast console. If you're on a Mac, please use Command R. Today's slide presentation is available for download in the green resources folder at the bottom of your screen. A certificate for continuing education credit is also available in the resources folder, and it's labeled certificate. You can also find several other resources from our sponsors. Make sure to grab these resources, the slides, and your CE certificate sooner rather than later. Once the webcast ends, you will no longer have access to that folder. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. You can tweet us at Library Journal with the hashtag LJDesignStory. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. We have Joe Agati, Director of Design at Agati Furniture, and we have Lee Swanson, Associate and Senior Project Architect at richärd+bauer. And today, Joe and Lee will be discussing how the history and story behind your community's library can be points of engagement from a design perspective. And leading up to this webcast, I started thinking about this topic. It's a really interesting connection to make between the story of your library and the design elements involved. And I was thinking about my own library. I grew up in Schaumburg, Illinois. And even though I was aware through elementary school that the whole area was kind of developed in the late 60s, early 70s as far as residential development goes, I didn't know too much about what happened before then. So I looked up the history of the library, and it turns out it actually began inside of a house, the same corner where it still stands today, and eventually expanded. And when I was in school, the library was my home away from home, and Schaumburg Library was just awesome to me. And they had expansive reference sections, microfiche room. The downstairs had the records. Yes, I'm that old, and all the music stuff. And it was a really great place to be. And, I haven't lived there for quite some time, but looking at their website, I see that several years ago, they expanded to over 160,000 square feet. And looking at the pictures, it's just amazing. And, to see it now and to know how much that area has grown, it really does, I think, reflect not just the history, but the growing needs of the community. So I'm glad that this webcast kind of spurned my curiosity to look into my own favorite library from all those years ago. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our speakers today. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a great conversation before we hopped online, because it reminded me what our webinar is all about. And I'm so happy that struck a chord with you, because I think that everybody has a story about their library as they grew up, whether it's just going to see a children's program in the reading room, or reading your favorite magazine or book as a young child, or researching at your college library. Looking back, there's always either a personal story about how you used the library, or something about the library that struck a chord. So thanks for that conversation. But we also had a conversation about Halloween. So before we started, I just want to say Happy Halloween to everybody out there. And we did clarify with the team here, none of us are wearing costumes today. But, the saying, picture everybody in the audience in their underwear. I'm going to picture everybody in our audience in a Halloween costume. So we'll start off with that. So happy Halloween. I am Lee Swanson. I am an associate and senior project architect at richärd+bauer Architects here in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm originally from the Midwest, but I've been a part of the Arizona design community for over 17 years. and have been focused on library design for the past 11 years with richärd+bauer Architects. I am a member of the American Institute of Architects and will be on the state board in 2018. I'm a LEED accredited professional, a member of the USGBC, and also ALA.
And I am Joe Agati. For those of you that have attended our webinars in the past, my background will be familiar to you. I've started off in my early part of my career in toy design, and then transitioned to the family business that my father started as the director of design, and now I'm chief operating officer and director of design here at Agati. And Agati's had a long-standing tradition of doing product and product for library spaces in general, and it's been a great pleasure to come on board here and bring design philosophy that I shared in my early part of my career back to Agati.
So we're going to divide our topic into two levels, the macro level and the micro level. Macro level I'm going to cover with larger design items relating to the architecture of the buildings. And then Joe's going to talk a little bit about the micro level down to the furniture. And both of these topics are going to cover how design can tell your unique story. But I'd like to start with the macro level and how architecture, interior design can tell your unique story. And if you recall, when you registered, there were several questions that we had you answer when you registered. And a couple of those questions were on purpose to start you thinking about what your unique story is. So if you recall back to registering, one question is what is your favorite library and why? And the second question is what makes your library, your community, and your story unique? So as we move through this process, I want to make sure that you're thinking about that as we move through these slides, because ultimately all the things that we're talking about today are really to help you develop your story and show you ways that we've used our client stories in design to help celebrate and tell their story. So remember that when we move forward as the answers to those questions, and think about that as we move through this process of what is your unique story. We're going to cover why it's important. We're going to try to help you discover your own story through a few different categories. We're going to use case studies from our office to show you how design can celebrate your story. And then we're going to translate your story into action and a little bit of programming, more detailed development as we move forward. So we also were talking earlier about libraries today because they have changed since we were kids. You know, it's not just books, magazines, and some story time here and there. It's really become a lot different. And we've seen that from all the projects that we've started working on, that the programs are changing and advancing with programs of outreach to the communities. There are digital media classrooms, media production. I'm actually headed out to a groundbreaking ceremony for one of the projects I'm talking about today that has multiple different programs. They have a demonstration kitchen. They have a recording studio. They have a green screen room for media production. So the libraries are much more about a central hub to communities and reaching out to the communities and bringing them in and providing services not just only as resources of media, but also resources for program and connecting the community together as a whole. And because of that, you know, we feel it's important that you have an integrated team from the beginning. Our office is not only architecture, we also have interior design and graphic design. And we work with a full team from the very beginning of the project that includes our office, library leadership, library staff, the community, furniture designers and furniture providers, and the contractor. And it's very important in the process, and I encourage you to try to have that large team integrated on your project as early on in the process, because it ensures that your story and the things we're going to talk about today have a much better chance of being a part of all these different components that we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to go through, try to help you find what your unique story is. And we start out when we program and look at several different areas when we talk about what is your unique story. Community, culture, history, institution, region, landscape. And we start off with interviews with community members and library staff and patrons, but we also do our own research because we think that this part of the program is very important in the beginning of the process. And why is that important? Well, one, it engages your colleagues and your peers in your community from the get-go, and that really creates a feeling of ownership and involvement. The earlier you engage your community and your colleagues and peers in this process, you build relationships, but it also helps you understand the needs and the story of your community. And as they see that grow and develop through the design process and see it as a built project, they do take ownership and feel more involvement with that process, which is critical for the life and long-term sense of ownership for your community in that library. So how can you discover your story? One thing we always try to do, as I said in programming, is really try to understand the culture and community that you live in. Who are your patrons? What cultural backgrounds do they share? And what are their traditions? This can be how old your patrons are, or how young they are. What cultural backgrounds do they share? Do they have fine arts programs that are important to the community? Or do they have traditions that they celebrate throughout different times of the year? All these things can help you understand a better idea of the culture and community of your area. The region and landscape. Every region has a different feel across the United States. We do projects in all across the country, and we're fascinated by all the different landscapes that we see in different sites that we work on. But they can be landforms as far as mountains, plateaus, deserts here in Arizona. It can be geology, rock formations, and how you clad your building with those rocks. But it can also be agriculture, farming communities, and what you see as the landscape in your region is all important information to have that can inspire your project. So we encourage everyone to research and understand their region and landscape. And then understanding your history, not just the current people that reside in your area, but who settled the land, who was around before, and how did your community develop over time? What industries helped your community flourish from back when it was originally settled? And what businesses and commerce have developed through the years to really make your city and your region what it is today? All of those things can be important factors that can tell your story through design. And also understanding your institution. You may not be a public library. You may work for an academic library. Your institution can help tell your story as well, defining your goals, defining your vision. But your library can be part of a bigger vision that represents your institution, and that can help tell your story as well. So how can design celebrate your story? We've taken 4 case studies of projects that we've worked on, and are going to talk a little bit about them using the categories that we discussed and show you how we use design to help tell the story of each of these communities through our design. The first project is the Patience Ladding Library in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. It's a 40,000 square foot branch library. So I'd never been to Oklahoma City before we got this project. So traveling out to Oklahoma City was actually a real treat and surprising in a lot of senses. I didn't realize how big a part the oil industry played in the development of Oklahoma. There are oil derricks all across the state and oil pumps working overtime. There's even an oil derrick directly next to the state capitol. And everybody in Oklahoma celebrates this. They know that this is a background of theirs. There's also a history of Pawnee. which is also a great part of their history. The Pawnee created these really interesting earth dwellings where there was a wood framework that they would mound up the earth over this wood framework and live, and the grasses and landscape would grow up over them. So there's just some great history that really helped us think about the design of the building in a different way that represented their community as a whole. So as you can see here, this is an exterior view of the library. We actually used the derrick forms to build and integrate the structure of our building into those forms you see popping up above the roof line. So that tied into that local industry of the derrick and the oil industry. But you can also see in the foreground, we took the landscape and mounted it up against the building. You can imagine this big oval landscape mound comes up on two sides of this building and really integrates the building into the landscape and ties back to that history of the Pawnee earth dwelling. As I said before, it's a 40,000 square foot branch library, fairly standard setup with a multi-purpose room, reading area, internet access and computer commons, work area, and a children's story time room that actually doubles as a tornado shelter. But in the plan here, what you see are these green squares that are sprinkled throughout the space and one large orange one. Those are actually the derrick forms that translate into the interior of the space. So as you drive by on the outside, you see the derricks pop up above, and when you come back in, you see them on the interior. So those derricks have skylights that bring natural light into the space and start to define the different areas of the library. The derrick you see in this photo is the info desk and circulation desk directly at the entry of the building. Another interesting part about Oklahoma is that Route 66 runs through it. And what's interesting about that is that you can drive Route 66 throughout Oklahoma and really get a sense of what Oklahoma is all about, from agriculture through the industry, commerce, the retro signs, the Route 66 bowling alleys, and windmills of the agricultural community dot the landscape across Oklahoma. And we really wanted to integrate that into the interiors of the building to give you a sense and a feel for what Oklahoma is like in this library. So we were inspired by the history and the signage and wayfinding within the building. We used imagery of wheat and agriculture on the end panels of our book stacks throughout the library. And as you can see in the background, we used the inspiration of those Route 66 retro signs in our wayfinding signage. So in the back, you can see that suspended sign, reading a lounge, and magazines that really pull in that retro sense of the Route 66 signage. And what I want you to think about as I move to this next case study is we really pride ourselves on libraries that are about place. So, you can imagine trying to pick up that Oklahoma City library and moving it to another site, and it doesn't quite work. So as we move through these, I want you to think about that and think about where your library is and what's unique about it, and how can you make it a library that you can't pick up and move to another site. So you can imagine that oil derrick library now at our second site, which is Las Vegas, doesn't make any sense here. But this second case study is East Las Vegas Library. It's just north of Old Downtown in Las Vegas. And we were really inspired in a different sense on this project because of the community and the early programming sessions that we had with the community, engaging them early. 80% of the patrons in this area are low-income Hispanic. And throughout this process, a reoccurring theme came up, which is the idea of large space for community events, both interior and exterior spaces. So we were inspired by the traditional mercado or markets, inspired because of their relationship to the Hispanic culture, but also the vibrancy that comes with that. You can see market stands in the upper photo, all the fruit and the wares of all these wonderful colors and vibrancy and activity. And the image on the bottom, the informal mercado along a street edge, where all of these different colored canopies create really quite a beautiful, vibrant image of the Mercado. So we learned from that culture, and that culture inspired the built form. So you can see in this plan of the library, it really wraps an outdoor plaza space where all the trees are in the center of the image. And we wanted to use that canopy idea and put shade out in that plaza space, but also pull that color and vibrancy into the interior of the library. So as you can see, we use the canopy and the color and the vibrancy to create shade in these outdoor spaces, but really create a vibrant outdoor plaza for the community events. And then we pull that into the building to continue that vibrancy through color and references to that cultural inspiration into the library. Another part of that project that we used history to tell the story was using the idea of the Talavera tile. Talavera tile is a traditional Mexican tile making process where they use indigo as a main color for the tile. Back when these tiles were a part of the culture, indigo was an expensive material, so the Talavera tile was often put on important or prominent buildings in the area. So when you saw this Talavera tile, you knew that was an important building. So we used that culture to inspire material and color on our project, but not in a literal sense of using the exact tile, but we did use these oversized, large format tiles that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, and the color blue because of that reference to the indigo back to that Talavera tile. Now, one thing to think about, why is this important? We don't do this just, to have an interesting story when we work with the client, but the idea is that we work with the client so that they can tell the story as well, and that the patrons can learn the story, and they can go out into the community and tell that story to others. So that is the cyclical thing about not just how you tell the story, but how your community will start to understand that story and be proud and take ownership of your project. And our third case study is the Prescott Valley Public Library. This is actually in Arizona, about an hour and a half north of Phoenix. And what's interesting about this region, and actually a good portion of northern Arizona, is that it's used to be a volcanic area. So a lot of our mountains are actually inactive volcanoes. Now, what was great about this project is when we went there was actually a good deal of the community that had no idea that they had an inactive volcano directly adjacent to their city, which was kind of a fun thing for us to find out, but also fun, to share that with community members, as some of them did not know. But the image on the top is Bald Mountain, just outside of the site. You can kind of see that there's a divot in the center and a little lava dome. So that blew its top and is now an inactive volcano in Prescott Valley. So that landscape influenced the built form of how we looked at building our library. So this is the Prescott Valley Public Library with that central form that represents the lava dome at the center and the rest of the building wrapping around, representing that volcano as a whole. This project was 50,000 square feet, so that what we call the lava dome at the center was actually a town council chamber and a performance space, and it had a large sky deck on top that you could go up and see the surrounding landscapes from the building. Another interesting part about Bald Mountain is that they used to use it as part of a heliograph system. So back when the military was trying to communicate without cell phones, they had a heliograph, which is the image you see at the bottom. So they would station these heliographs on peaks throughout Arizona and then use the reflection of the sun to communicate long distances very quickly to help the military. So we were inspired by that, and it helped us inform our light fixture selection. So what you see here is the main reading area of the library. It's a two-story space, and that back area is that large form that pops out of the center of the building. But what you see along that second level floor line are light fixtures that are actually pointed up instead of down. And then up at the wood ceiling, you see those small round discs. There's 6 of them up there. Those are actually reflective mirrored panels that reflect the light back down into the space. So we were able to pull in that concept of the heliograph, old technology, and relate it to new technology that we put into the library. Another fun thing about this project, we actually were able to go out and hike Bald Mountain. There's a lot of outdoor activity and hiking in this area, and we wanted to pull that into the design as well. So there's a lot of camping and hiking, and we took that to help inspire our interior space. So what you see in the upper right are actually small meeting rooms that are inside the higher ceiling or higher volume of the space. And we designed those to reflect the campsite. So what you see inside those spaces are cables that are kind of like tent stakes and cables that hold this together. But the idea of relating this back to a campsite out in the wilderness and exploration relating to the library and finding information was an important part of how we looked at this project. Case study 4 and our final case study is the Cruz and Murray Library. Now this is an academic library. So this one was really more about understanding the institution. They had several goals that related to the larger vision of their campus. The majority of their buildings on campus are either historic, as you see in the bottom left image, or trying to replicate that historic style. But they wanted to change that. They wanted an architectural icon building that brought them into the future and represented them moving into the future. So it was about their institutional goals. They also wanted the library to be a gateway, and I'll show you why that is in a second. But they also had this history of creating an intellectual hub that was popular in different parts of their campus that I'll start to explain as well. The library is in Caldwell, Idaho, which is about 45 minutes west of Boise, Idaho. So what you see as a triangle in the bottom part of the page is the campus, and then obviously Caldwell outside of that. But the main access to Caldwell is that red arrow that comes off of the adjacent highway. And it comes into town and tees into a street, pretty much dead ends that campus. And that red oval that you see is the site for the library. So when they talk about iconic building and the library as a gateway, that really represented the gateway to their campus from the main point of access for Caldwell. So as you can see here, this does not look like a historic building on campus. It's really designed as an architectural icon and really kind of a beacon, a lantern at night. So you can see that there is a lot of glass, but it's also very transparent, and that's where the gateway came in. We wanted to preserve views into the campus from that road as you come up to campus. So it's kind of a visual gateway. You can see the stacks and the spaces inside, but you can also see through it to the campus beyond. And it's this architectural icon on the edge of the campus. This again is a 40,000 square foot library roughly. It was a challenging idea to try to design a library that's not rectangular. But it was a fun one. So you can see here we kept a lot of the hard spaces towards the center of the building. And what that allowed us to do is to push the furniture and the stacks towards the edges of the building and really focus on the views from those areas out and outside in to those spaces. We really wanted to also focus on this idea of the intellectual hub. That was one of their goals. And they had a really strong example of this on campus. One area on campus that they actually named the Boone Table has to do with a simple piece of furniture that was in one of their buildings that all of the TAs would hang out at after class and before class. And it really became an intellectual hub for conversation and discussion and learning, not from professors, but from your classmates. And it became a spot for social interaction. And just this simple table became a symbol on campus for this intellectual hub and communication, and became a large part of their culture and tradition on campus. So part of their goal, when we had their programming discussion of that, is how do you recreate that, or how do you translate that into a new library space? So we took that to heart, and that idea of this institution informed customized furniture. And Joe's going to talk a little bit more about this, but it was really about trying to replicate that idea of the Boone Table as the cultural hub within the library, but do it in more of a modern way in the library, using furniture in a space, in a large, grand reading room, and how you create that intellectual hub within the library. So what we'd like to talk about now is, we've given you some ideas of how you can start to discover your story, why that's important, and then giving you some examples of how we've used our clients' stories to inform the design of projects in multiple different ways. But we want to get a little bit more in detail and talk to you a little bit about how you can translate your story into actionable items on more of a micro scale. So this is where we're going to transition, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Joe.
Joe, you might be on mute. We can't hear you yet.
Oh, I apologize. Sorry about that, everybody. Thank you, Lee, for the transition. So, like Lee was saying, we just kind of went through the high level of building and space and interior and how that relates to your story. And now I want to talk to you about how we bring it down to a micro level. As I talked about earlier, my expertise and the background that I have is related to product. And so I want to take you guys through kind of like the thought process that we use when we're, approaching a new space and trying to figure out what makes sense in there. So our process is like, it's actually not that unique. It's not much different than any kind of other design process. But what I realized is that, not everyone went to design school like me. So what's not unique to us, it tends to be unique to other people. So when we look at it as a closed loop. It's not like a linear process where you start and you stop. The tricky part with design is that it's kind of ongoing. It's actually a very frustrating career because you're never done with anything. You do something, and you learn, you implement it, you look at it, and then you learn some more, and then you kind of go around and around and around. And it's frustrating, but it's also kind of the best part about it is that you're always continuing to evolve and improve. So under the first part, what we talk about is just getting this understanding. So when we look at product for a space, we first start thinking about, we're talking about culture. And when I say culture, I don't mean, someone's ethnic background or something like that. If we just kind of strip that away a little bit to some degree and look at it more from just like human beings, what is their kind of makeup? And then how does that translate into a predominant like work patterns? Because that's what really, that's what's going to be kind of happening in these spaces. People are going to come here, and work is a broad term, but they're going to be coming there. They're going to be using the space and using the product in a certain way. We want to understand the culture kind of from that perspective. So when we look at this, we kind of look at this in 6 different buckets when we look at culture. And it's not, and this is because it's a design process, it's not, always very linear. And so you kind of need to tweak it to yourself. But we find that most times things can fall into these 6 buckets. So you have like an extroverted culture. You can have an introverted culture. You can have a culture of what we call sprawlers, people that need a lot of space to conduct their activities. You may have a multi-generational makeup of your group. You may have a culture that likes to collaborate together, or you may have a culture that needs a very minimal space and minimal environment to work in. And when I say minimal, I don't mean like small space. I mean that someone like that's going to really appreciate clean lines, clean aesthetics, clean and orderly space. And then from there, we kind of then start breaking things down into roughly these kind of work patterns. Now, you may find, your space may be a little unique. You may have some work pattern doesn't fall exactly in this, and that's okay. It's more just going through that observational process and how do I break these things down. If you have like 100 work patterns, you're not kind of lumping them together enough. You should really run away with like somewhere between 6 to 10. But when we look at this, we can usually put people in kind of a group collaborative work and then a group social. And there's a difference there. Collaboration means group of people are working together to solve or working on a problem. Working together socially is just you're sitting next to somebody and you're working together. Kinesthetic learners, you see a lot of people that like to work with their hands. I am one of those people. I'm a very heavy kinesthetic learner. You have people that are very tech focused, people that like to lounge. You can have having tutoring dynamic in your space. You can have a nomadic work pattern where I like to sit in this chair one day and then like to travel over to the table the next day and then lounge around on the floor or whatever it may be. You can have people that, they're not group workers, they're not social workers, that I need my space, I need, quiet, private area to work in to really focus. And then you can have, people that like to touch down. It's kind of similar to nomadic, but it's more of a quicker kind of nomad. They're going to kind of touch down 10 minutes, in and out, in and out. They're maybe not going to stay in one place for very long. So kind of bucketing things in cultures and work patterns into there. We kind of go walk people through the next phase of, this research mode. So what are your predominant work patterns? And then we start asking, are they real or created? Because that's something you have to take into consideration. So I've had conversation where people will tell me, oh, the kids love the big tables. And that's great that they love the big tables, but what else do you have? Well, we only have the big tables. That's how I know they love them. Like, is it they love or lack of options? And sometimes that can be hard to, it's hard to be objective until you really force yourself. So a lot of that comes from then this kind of observation. So you're observing, you're observing all the way along this, but you're asking yourself these questions, and then as you kind of ask these questions, you kind of go back out and you really go through this heavy observation. What's the first product to fill up? So, all the tables fill up. Yeah, but what product fills up first? Well, those standing height tables over there, those are always filled. Those are the first thing the kids sit at. Or that cluster of chairs over in the corner? Yeah, that's the first thing that fills up. So, maybe there's a misbalance of space. Yes, there are people that I'm sure love the big tables. Maybe you have a heavy sprawling culture. Maybe you have a heavy group, social group work dynamic in your space. But, if you see one space filling up quicker, faster than the others, maybe you could be a little out of balance there. But that really comes from that observational component to the process. And then we go into the investigation, and then this is kind of, this can be the annoying part. So asking, I equate it to a child asking why. And what it allows you to do is it really allows you to kind of like dig down to the root cause of things. And I tell people, if you probably haven't asked why 7 times, you may not really know why they may be doing something. So why the big tables? Well, I like to spread out. Why do you like to spread out? Well, I don't like to sit next to people while I work. Why don't you like to sit next to people while you work? Well, because it's really hard for me to focus when I feel like I have something breathing down my neck. Okay, well, that's only 3 whys, and it's like, okay, now I'm really starting to understand this person and what they want to do. They want to have a space where they feel comfortable and secure. They don't want to maybe have their back to the environment while they work. It's hard for them to focus when they're in that kind of environment. So, yeah, maybe it's that they like the sprawling aspect of it. So they maybe need a large workspace that's fairly private for them to be able to focus. So it's really getting down to that root level. And it can be reasons like, coming up with electrical, better lighting. I mean, there's kind of an infinite possibility. But as you start to ask people and talk to people, you'll start to see the patterns emerge. And then the next level is the testing period. So this is harder for people to do, but definitely worthwhile when you can get it to work, where you can, you're going to start to develop what we call like concepts or theories, and you want to test them out because your first concept, well, yes, I think this, that, and the other, until you really kind of, put it out there, you're not really going to know. And especially if you're working on a large scale project, you're going to want to, test drive things, whether you can maybe get some furniture samples on site, rearranging the space, pulling furniture out, adding other furniture in, just running some experiments just to kind of say, hey, we gathered all this data now how do we really prove it? And then the last part is kind of the creation. So coming up and then presenting back and getting buy-in from your community, your vendor partners, architects, interior designers, and then you got to go and create what you came up with. So I want to walk you guys through this kind of process and how we used it on 2 different projects. Lee spoke about College of Idaho. So in this instance, we want to start off, okay, what are the predominant work patterns and what are the culture of the user? And so like Lee said earlier, the library was this thought, this gateway, this intellectual hub. And that's coming right from faculty and students. So that's coming from them. That gives us a clue into the culture that they want to have or want to create. So it's probably going to be extroverted, probably collaborative. I'm guessing, but probably going to have a heavy element of sprawling that, if they're going to want to work together in groups or whatever, they're probably going to need a fair amount of space to do that in. And they alluded to that, the Boone Table, as they called it earlier. So what are the work patterns going to be? Probably mostly group, either collaborative or social. It's hard to say. Probably there's going to be a lounge element in there. What Lee didn't talk about was, they alluded to, they like the Boone Table, like other things, but there was a lack of comfort. So there may be a lounging component to the work patterns as well. So taking that into consideration, going through the research and observation phase, we kind of learned, about their background, about their culture. So they want large work areas, they want group meeting space, they want this comfort element. And then kind of taking that through the investigation part, okay, so we have all of that. Is that enough? We just had the Boone Table. That satisfied a lot of it, but is that enough? Well, no. So, in today's age, we need access to power. We need access to data. Lighting. There's a lighting component that we want to bring into the furniture. Comfort. The Boone Table is great. It's not very comfortable. And then there's like a aesthetic standard that they want to set for the new space. So how do we create this Idaho aesthetic in the product? And so that's where it lends up nicely with one of our standard products, but not all of it. So, adding power to it, or adding lighting, integrating power, managing power down to the floor, that's always kind of tricky to do. It's actually one of the more complicated things we do in furniture. And then instead of using a bench seat or something like that, using more individualized chairs to create that comfort element for people. And then bringing in the quote-unquote Idaho aesthetic. So being able to offer the table, so the table comes with a solid wood base, and then translating wood throughout the product, except for in the work surface, we use a wood laminate to kind of still hold that look, but you want the laminate for that long-term durability. The veneers are nice. They're very warm to the touch and to the senses, but they're just not going to really hold up in the public space as well as a plastic laminate would. So that's how the process kind of went through on that project. I want to give you another example. This was Scottsdale's Community College. And going through the same kind of steps here, understanding the culture. And community colleges are tricky because they're a makeup of a lot of different people. I went to University of Illinois, which is down in central southern Illinois, and it's pretty much kind of like the same people that are all there. They're all from Chicago, suburb of Chicago, or rural Illinois. But it's very homogenous. Well, a community college is very different. You have a large makeup of a lot of different people, so you're going to be dealing with a lot of different kind of cultures and work patterns. So you can have, for them, extroverts, introverts, sprawlers, multi-generational. You find that a lot at community colleges, people that maybe have been out of the workforce or coming back in, and at Scottsdale, having collaborative element as well. So, and then with that, obviously, the more cultures you're going to have, the more quote-unquote predominant work patterns you're going to have, and they probably check almost all the boxes, which makes it challenging in trying to balance out the space, but not impossible. So you're going to have group collaborative, group social, tech, lounge, touchdown, solo, nomadic. Now, it's not to say that you won't have kinesthetic learners and you won't have tutoring going on there, but it's probably just not a predominant work pattern in that environment. So going through this kind of research and observation phase, they have a diverse group of users. They want to reduce their stacks. They want to increase their sight lines in the library, make it more warm, opening, inviting. And the big thing is they wanted to change their service model. So they felt like the current library they had, they weren't able to service the students and the patrons very well. So this was a big theme for them. So through the investigation, so this is the library space. You can see it's very open. There's a very diverse makeup of furniture. In this picture alone, you've got some touchdown space, some lounge space, some, large sprawling space, computer space, things like that. Here you got, some sprawling space, lounge space. It's a little hard to see, but we're going to focus in on this particular product right there. So because we didn't really talk about, what does this mean? We want to change the service model. So they want to create a unique way to interact with users. And this kind of became the kind of whole segment in this project, where they wanted this element that basically a user could come up to, a librarian could sit there with them, interact with them, answer questions, show them how to do research, whatever it may be, provide services to that user. They needed a technology component, so they wanted to be able to provide this service information through a technology angle. They wanted to be mobile. They wanted a certain level of mobility and flexibility to their space. They didn't want to have a big service desk that was like stuck somewhere in like a giant spaceship. This big barrier to interacting with the staff. And they knew technology was going to evolve and change over time. So how do they access that? So that became a big component. So that translated into this element here. So you have your user and library inside. You have your technology integrated into the piece. You have your mobile components, so we're able to kind of put that on Caster to satisfy, not having to have this big desk in the middle of a room that was permanent, that this unit could be mobile and moved around throughout the space. And then creating elements to be able to access the electrical. Technology is tricky because it does evolve, and you really don't want to have technology integrated in such a way that you can't upgrade it. The furniture should really be kind of a platform for any tech component that you can kind of change in and out fairly easily. So that's kind of two ways we go through this kind of what we call like the micro process, and walking people through to try to understand what from the culture side to the user side to the work pattern side, and then delivering that through into the product to achieve the right kind of balance in the space. So I'm going to turn it back over to Lee now.
Thanks, Joe. So I want to go back to the questions that we asked you when you registered, because I think that's a takeaway that you can take from this discussion, take back to your colleagues, take back to your community. And now that we went through this, I encourage you to take those questions yourself and answer those again and see if your answers are different, now that you have these tools to use. But I also encourage you to take those and ask your colleagues to answer those questions, ask your community to answer those questions, and then collect all that together and look at your space. What is your unique story? We know why it's important. You now know how to discover it. But how can design celebrate your story in your space? Maybe you're renovating your space. Maybe you're actually looking for a new space. But now we have this information that you can start and understand how you can translate your story into action. So we encourage you to engage your community even before you engage a professional. There's multiple ways to do that. It's as easy as starting with those questions that we gave you. Surveys, interviews, programming with a professional are all great ways to engage your community early and often. And we encourage you to challenge your design professionals to tell your unique story. We know that designers can be challenging sometimes, but the best designers are the best listeners. So we really want you to go out there and challenge your design professionals and tell them about what your unique story is. You now have the background to tell your unique story, so tell that to your design professionals and make sure that they hear you and that they can integrate that into your project. So we don't just want you to define your story. We need you to share it, and we want you to celebrate it along with your designers and your community as a whole. So we'd like to thank you for your time today, but we also have a few books that you can reference that relate to how we program spaces. Problem Seeking is a great book for a background on beginning programming for architectural spaces. The Universal Traveler is a problem-solving book as well that will help you program. And then Change Your Space, Change Your Culture by Rex Miller, who is a futurist, will make you maybe think a little bit differently about how you use space and what the future brings. So with that, I'd like to hand it back over to Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Lee, and thank you, Joe, as well. I'd like to open up the floor for questions from the audience. If you have a question to submit for Lee or Joe, please send those in now. We do have a few minutes. Lee, I'm going to turn to you first. Way back in the beginning of the webcast, you discussed process. And let's see. And here you kind of reiterated that one of the first things you want to do is engage your community. Would this process be the same for a community college library that was built in the 70s?
Well, we always go at the projects in a very similar manner, but how we do it and who we invite to the process is different depending on the library. So when we program a space, when we start, as I said earlier, we always look at these key factors, and we do a lot of research up front, but we also try to talk to the patrons, talk to the staff, and listen to them. And there's multiple ways we can do that through questionnaires. We really like to do what's called charrettes, where we engage the community and the staff for up to 5 days in a row with meetings and sessions where they can come and tell us about them, but we can also share our process with them. So our process tends to be similar for different types of projects, but we tweak it a bit depending on who we're inviting to those meetings, whether it's an academic library or a public library branch. And a lot of times those categories that we went to, like the College of Idaho, we kind of honed in on the institutional aspects of their goal setting that really inform the story, whereas maybe a public branch library is much more about the community driven.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Joe, I've got a question for you. As you were speaking to this slide, one attendee is asking, how big is this library? His is a little less than 20,000 square feet.
That's a great question. And Lee may actually know that because that is a richärd+bauer project. Lee, do you? Yeah. I know Kelly worked on this one. How big was the Scottsdale Community College?
This was right around 30,000 square feet. And one interesting note on this one that they may not know, this is actually a remodel project. So this is an old historic building. It was built in the 60s and renovated. And one of the things we find most interesting about renovation projects, is what you can find when you tear everything out. So you can see in this image there's clear story windows in the background. That was all covered by lay-in ceiling tile. So, it was this great discovery when you go in and you rip all this out, some of these unique features and gems that you can find in remodel projects.
Okay, great. Thank you. And having done some renovation projects of my own, I know sometimes you don't want to know what's behind that wall.
That is true.
And there was one, Lee, several slides back, and you kind of discussed it, kind of had the open air feel. And one attendee is asking if heating and cooling is a problem with a building of that type.
So if College of Idaho, there's a couple of them, but that one has a lot of glass. So one of the things I didn't dig into on that one, but it relates directly to that question, we actually had a special shade screen thin system that we integrated into the design of that building. So if you picture that oval floor plan, we actually did solar studies with the angle of that building and placed shade fins that circled the building entirely, but were rotated to protect the interior building from the sun. And that project specifically had a geothermal heat pump system, and actually had, I believe, a 60% reduction in overall energy use because of the systems we integrated into that project. So we were able to allow views in and out in the appropriate directions, but we used the shade fins to block the sun at certain times of the year.
Okay, great. And then this question could probably go out to each of you. Joe, I'll let you weigh in first. What are some of the unique challenges of smaller libraries? And this particular attendee said she's working with 12,000 square feet.
That's a good question. I think what we've run into is, and I don't know if it can be space and probably space and budget driven. But it's really, I guess, the smaller you get, trying to find the best balance for your group. I think you can get there, and anybody can definitely get there, and size becomes irrelevant. I think as the smaller you go, it gives you less places to hide. So if you're bigger, the bigger space you have, or the bigger spaces we've worked on, you can kind of say, yeah, we can do this over here, we can do this over here, do this over here. And you just have kind of not infinite, but large areas to kind of start to, what you think need to accommodate everything. But sometimes less is more, and if you really kind of ask yourself the difficult questions, push your guys' self, you can really try to find the balance. So I think, it's just kind of that if you're in a tight space and just really pushing yourself, I think can be challenging for people, but it can be done.
Yeah, I completely agree with Joe. I think smaller spaces, you have some challenges with variations in type of space, not being able to accommodate everything that you want to because you're limited on space. But another challenge that we see often that is almost always a request on our projects is flexibility. With all these different program types, a lot of the library staff want to be able to have flexible space that they can move furniture around and change the use. That can be challenging when you have a small space, a smaller library space. So integrating flexible space into a small library is a challenge, but an opportunity as well.
Okay, great. Thanks for that answer. Another attendee kind of asked about the challenges of small spaces as well, and I can imagine that's something that comes up on a regular basis. Another attendee is asking or stating, we recently renovated part of our library as well. How would you recommend design on the micro level with limited funding?
I think, on design on the micro level with limited funding, I think the first part of that is going through, asking yourself the questions, and see what you can test basically for free. What can you observe from your space? What can you rearrange? What can you try to learn really before you spend any dollars? You may find out that you don't need to spend any money. You may be closer than you think, and you may just need to, maybe it's one or two chairs, or maybe it's a couple tables, but really there's more of there could be a flow issue. There could just be the way stuff is set up. I've got, I'm not sure if people who attended our Designing for Human Behavior webinar prior to that. But I think, I don't know, Rebecca, if that link is still live on LJB's website. But in there we talk about, understanding how people work and the behaviors behind, designing a space to make people feel comfortable. And you may find that, hey, I've got heavy traffic right next to, my group where people should be working kind of quietly and removed. Well, that's just not going to work in and of itself. So you may have the right furniture, you just may have it, placed inappropriately. So it's really that kind of testing or experimentation stage. You may want to spend more time there and try more things really before you kind of execute on dollars.
That makes sense. And we are just about out of time. I'm going to throw out one more question. This attendee is asking, we're a small branch in a diverse urban area and always trying to figure out how to get patrons who just come in for their material to stay and use the space. They are busy, but we have so much to offer. How do we turn our branch into a third space for those who are working during the week? Any ideas?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we find a lot of our libraries asking that same question. Without knowing the exact programs that you have, one thing that I would suggest is look at the programs that you currently have and how you get that out to the community so they know what you offer. Is it a marketing campaign? Is it signage? Is it just the interaction of the staff with the people that come to your site every day? That's a great way to do it. But program-wise, we see a lot of libraries introducing cafes, coffee shops, larger lounge areas that, towards the front of the building that really draw people in to stay. So depending on the programs you have, I would say, how you market yourselves and communicate and interact with your patrons. But also if you have some dollars, some funds, think about what types of furniture you can use or even additional programs that you can introduce that might keep them longer.
Yeah, that's a good point, Lee. And I would just kind of add on to that what we have observed is that it's not one thing. There's probably small little things which makes it challenging to kind of pinpoint down. That being said, though, there's things that because there are a number of little things. That's where you're going to have to kind of go through and try a little thing to really see just what starts to work. I'm kind of always an advocate of, experiment before you spend the money, like I said earlier in my earlier response, because there's probably an element of staff interaction. There could be an element of services. There could be an element of aesthetic. Maybe it's just not inviting looking. There's a number of kind of factors that go into there. So if you're really kind of just focusing on one, it's you may be missing the four other components that really are causing the issue.
Okay, great. Thanks so much to both of you for weighing in on that. Final question for the day. We have run through our hour. Audience members, thank you so much for your questions. If we did not get to yours, you can expect a follow-up via email soon. Please don't forget to visit that green resources folder. Make sure to grab a copy of the slides, your CE certificate, and the materials from Agati and richärd+bauer. Thanks so much to our presenters, Lee and Joe. Thanks to Agati and richärd+bauer, and of course, Library Journal. This webcast will be archived, and we'll send you an email to let you know when it's available, usually in about 24 hours. You can find this webcast, the archived webcast from Agati that Joe was talking about, as well as all other archived and upcoming webcasts at libraryjournal.com. We do hope you have a very happy Halloween today. Stay safe tonight, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.